You won't believe what they found in a Virginia farmhouse in 1834. In the spring of that year, tucked deep in the peaceful hills of central Virginia, a shocking discovery was made, one that would expose a level of darkness almost too disturbing to believe. 47 children, yes, 47, were found chained up in the basement of what looked like a completely normal farmhouse. These kids were between 6 and 16 years old, and here's the twisted part. None of them were related. They all spoke different languages. They came from different parts of the world. And when authorities tried to speak with them, they whispered only one name, Mother Sullivan. Now here's where it gets even more insane. A sheriff's report that was buried for over a century in the dusty archives of Henrico County detailed what the officers saw down there. It was so disturbing, 3 officers quit within 1 week. They couldn't take it. That's how messed up this was. But wait, it gets darker. This wasn't some one-time crime. Constance Sullivan, the woman they called Mother, had been running this twisted operation for over 20 years without being caught. Let that sink in. Decades of horror, all hidden beneath a regular-looking farmhouse. Now, before we dive deeper into the twisted secrets of Sullivan family, I've got a serious question for you. Brain, this channel is not for the faint-hearted. It's for people who are brave enough to uncover what most try to forget. So, if you're still here, you're one of us. Hit that subscribe button and drop your state in the comments, because who knows, the next story could be from your own backyard. Now, back to the mystery. How could something so massive, so horrifying, go completely unnoticed in a quiet, tight-knit rural town? Here's the thing. In 1834, Virginia was a land in transition, caught between the fading grip of the old plantation system and the slow creep of modernization. And in that strange in-between space, monsters like Mother Sullivan didn't just survive. They thrived. You think a haunted mansion is scary? Wait till you hear what was happening in plain sight on a working farm in Virginia. While whispers of industrial change drifted down from the north like a rising storm, life in Millbrook, a sleepy village of just 50 families nestled in the rolling hills of Henrico County, was as ordinary as it gets. People farmed tobacco and corn. They traded supplies at Henderson's General Store. And every Saturday night, they packed into the one-room schoolhouse for church socials in town. Meetings. It was small-town America, cozy, peaceful, and quiet. But just outside town limits, tucked behind a row of tall elms, was a Sullivan property, 200 acres of rich farmland with a modest 2-story white farmhouse. It looked like every other house on the road. Between Millbrook and Richmond, nothing stood out. Nothing seemed off. The house was classic Virginia, white clapboard siding, a charming wraparound porch, a red barn out back, chickens, a smokehouse, even the occasional child playing in the fields. But here's the twist. What made this house terrifyingly unique was hidden beneath it. Ezra Sullivan, the original landowner, bought the place in 1809 using a fortune inherited from his father's tobacco empire. But instead of just planting crops, Ezra went underground, literally. He started expanding the basement, but not like other root cellars you'd find on Virginia farms. This thing was massive. It stretched far beyond the house's actual size, more like a bunker or a labyrinth. Local workers remember being called in piecemeal jobs, always paid in cash, and told not to ask questions. No need to worry about the full plan, Ezra would say. Just dig this part. No one ever saw the finished basement, and no one ever asked why. Then there was Constance Sullivan, Ezra's wife, who arrived in town in 1811, just 22 years old. Locals remembered her. Dark hair, a soft-spoken voice, simple dresses, quiet manners. She went to Methodist church when she was well enough and was known for giving to charity. But here's the part that fooled everyone. Whenever someone asked about the children spotted occasionally around the farm, Constance had a rehearsed answer. Oh, they're just some orphan relatives from Pennsylvania. We're helping until they find homes. And everyone bought it. No one asked more questions. No one suspected a thing. But those innocent glimpses? They were just the tip of a nightmare buried below, in a basement designed for something far more sinister than storage, where the most generous woman in town was hiding something horrifying in her wagon. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the town's general store, started noticing something odd. Every few weeks, Constance Sullivan would roll into town in her horse-drawn wagon. She was polite, quiet, and always had a perfectly organized list in hand. Nothing unusual, right? But then, children's faces, ghostly pale, silent, and wide-eyed, were sometimes seen peeking out from behind crates in the back of her wagon. Mrs. Henderson asked about them once. Constance smiled gently and said, "They're just shy, orphans, still traumatized. It's been hard." And back then, that explanation worked. This was the early 1800s. Orphan children were everywhere because of disease, war, and poverty. No one questioned it. Even Thomas Henderson, who ran the store with his wife, thought Constance was just an unusually kind woman with a tragic mission. But here's where things start getting weird. She wasn't buying for two people. She was buying for an entire army. Barrels of flour, pounds of pork, gallons of molasses, bottles of medicine. Every 2 weeks, she dropped serious cash for bulk supplies. When Thomas mentioned the massive quantities, she simply said, "Oh, those orphans eat a lot and they're sick often." And everyone just accepted it because Constance sounded so sincere. But the puzzle pieces were stacking up. Neighbors noticed that the Sullivan farm never slept. While most families rose with the sun and slept after dusk, the Sullivan house was lit up late into the night. People heard hammering, digging, and tools clanging when everything else in Millbrook was quiet. Ezra's excuse? We're expanding. The children need more space. Even the local doctor, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, started to feel something was off. He was called to the Sullivan farm many times in the 1820s and 30s. But get this, he never saw a single child. Constance always met him at the door, described vague symptoms, asked for very specific medicines. When Dr. Whitfield demanded to examine the children himself, she stopped him cold. They're too frightened, too broken. They can't handle strange men. And he believed her. So did everyone, even Reverend Samuel Matthews, the town pastor. He praised the Sullivans for their Christian compassion. He prayed for them. He thanked them publicly. No one saw it coming, because the greatest deception was that Millbrook believed they were witnessing kindness when really they were living next door to a nightmare disguised as charity. You won't believe how 47 children were discovered, and it all started with one freezing night. The townsfolk had no idea. Even when Reverend Matthews, the most trusted man in Millbrook, offered to help find real homes for the children, Constance Sullivan always had an answer ready. "Oh, don't worry, Reverend. We're already speaking with relatives in Pennsylvania. Everything's being arranged. It just takes time." But that time was a lie. So was the story. So was everything. What no one in the community realized, not even the pastor, the doctor, or the general store owners, was that Constance Sullivan had spent over 2 decades building a perfect illusion. The orphans weren't orphans. They weren't being adopted. They were being held hidden and hurt, stolen, trapped, forgotten. Some were purchased, some kidnapped, others lured away from their families across multiple states, and locked beneath that innocent-looking farmhouse in conditions so horrifying they would break even the toughest criminal. And then came the winter of 1834. Virginia was paralyzed. Temperatures dropped below freezing for weeks. Roads were snowed over. Livestock died. Families huddled for warmth. But for the 47 children chained beneath the Sullivan farmhouse, the cold was something else entirely. A silent killer or a potential savior. Because on February 23rd, a twist of fate rolled in on the wind. A traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was en route from Richmond to Charlottesville when a brutal snowstorm slammed into the hills. With visibility near zero and frostbite creeping in, Stern spotted the only building visible in the blizzard, the Sullivan farmhouse. He had no choice. He knocked, and though Ezra Sullivan looked like he'd rather swallow nails than open that door, he couldn't turn, away a freezing traveler in the middle of a deadly storm. Stern was allowed inside, but from the moment he crossed the threshold, something fell off. Dinner was awkward. Cornbread and salt pork served in silence. The Sullivans barely spoke. They kept exchanging nervous glances, twitching at every creak and groan of the old house. When Stern casually asked about the children he'd heard lived there, Constance quickly said, "They're asleep, sick with fever. Best not disturb them." But that night, lying on a makeshift bed in the coal parlor, Stern heard something that still haunts him to this day. Crying, muffled, faint, but unmistakable. Children sobbing from beneath the floorboards. Stern sat up, heart pounding, listening. He wasn't imagining it. The next morning, he mentioned it to Ezra, who smiled tightly and waved it off. "Oh, it's just the wind through the foundation. Happens all the time in old houses." Stern nodded. He left, but the sound, he never forgot it. And that sound was a crack that would break open one of the darkest secrets in American history. It only took one scream to bring 20 years of evil crashing down. Jacob Stern couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong at the Sullivan farm. The nervous glances, the eerie silence, the cries beneath the floorboards. He told himself it was just the wind, just the cold, but deep down, he knew something was off. And then just 3 weeks later, everything escalated. On March 15th, Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant, was traveling with her family, hoping to find work in the tobacco fields near Richmond. But during a treacherous river crossing, she got separated from the group, alone, cold, and just 15 years old. As night fell over the Virginia wilderness, she stumbled upon the only house she could see, the Sullivan farmhouse. Constance welcomed her in with a warm smile and a simple promise: food, shelter, safety. It would be the last time anyone saw Mary Catherine Flynn alive. When her family reported her missing to the Richmond sheriff, they gave a detailed description of where they'd last seen her. A search party was formed, but the Virginia wild was too vast, too cold, too dark. After a week with no sign, the search was called off. They assumed the worst: exposure, wild animals, the unforgiving wilderness. But the truth? Mary never left that house. And then came April 2nd, 1834, a day that would finally tear the mask off the Sullivan family for good. Local farmer William Hutchinson was out rabbit hunting near the wooded edge of the Sullivan property when something made him freeze in his tracks. Children screaming, not playing, not laughing, but screaming, raw, panic, soul-tearing screams of pure terror. He crept closer, hiding behind a thicket of oaks just 50 yards from the house. And for nearly an hour, he stood there, frozen, listening, watching. The sounds came and went, muffled but unmistakable, not from the house, but from beneath it. Then, movement. Ezra Sullivan emerged from a cellar door hidden in the side of the house. He glanced around, quick, twitchy, almost like an animal, then slipped back underground, shutting the door behind him. When Hutchinson rushed to tell neighbors what he'd seen, Millbrook was divided. Some people said the children were probably sick or maybe disturbed, needing care and strict discipline. That kind of thing wasn't unusual in those days. But others, they started remembering the massive quantities of food Constance bought every 2 weeks. The strange sounds, hammering, crying, whispering in the dark. The fact that, after 20 years, no one had ever seen one of the orphans at church, school, or town gatherings. And that's when Sheriff Benjamin Crawford got involved, a seasoned lawman who had patrolled Henrico County longer than anyone, and what he was about to find would haunt Virginia forever. This is the moment everything unraveled. For over 15 years, Sheriff Benjamin Crawford had heard the whispers, odd noises, strange purchases, orphans no one had ever seen. But like most, he chalked it up to small-town gossip, until William Hutchinson came to him face-to-face, visibly shaken, demanding to file a formal complaint. And now, Crawford had no choice. The law required him to follow up on any report of potential child abuse, no matter what he believed. So on the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford mounted his horse and rode toward the Sullivan farm, Deputy Marcus Webb at his side. They weren't expecting anything major, just a quick check, a polite chat, and hopefully a way to shut down the rumors for good. Seemed neat, polished, normal. But then Deputy Webb asked to use the privy. He stepped outside, walked around the side of the house, and stopped cold. There it was, the cellar door, just like Hutchinson had described. But it wasn't just a door. It was chained shut with 3 massive padlocks. Heavy iron chains crisscrossed the handles. The wood around the door frame was scratched to splinters, as if someone had been clawing to escape. Webb's heart dropped. He sprinted back to the house and whispered what he'd seen to Crawford. The sheriff's eyes darkened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't gossip. This was real. Crawford turned to Constant and politely asked to inspect the cellar. "Just to clear things up," he said. "Help us put the rumors to rest." And in an instant, her entire mask shattered. Constance went pale. Her hands trembled. She began stammering, her voice no longer calm. No, it's dangerous down there. The children don't go down there. There's nothing but old equipment storage." But then they heard it, a cry, low, weak, coming from beneath the kitchen floor. Then another voice, a child, barely audible. "Help!" Sheriff Crawford and Deputy Webb froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't animals. It wasn't imagination. It was human. It was children, and it was coming from directly below their feet. At that moment, they knew this wasn't charity. This wasn't kindness. It was a prison, and the truth was about to explode into the open. The truth they uncovered beneath that farmhouse broke even the strongest men. Sheriff Crawford would never be the same after what he saw that day. The moment he and Deputy Webb forced open the cellar door, a wave of pure horror hit them in the face. The smell, not just of rotten waste, but something worse, Sheriff Crawford later called it, the smell of despair itself. They descended into the darkness below, torches flickering, hearts pounding. What they found wasn't a cellar. It was a hell designed by hand. The basement, carved over 2 decades by Ezra Sullivan, was a fortress of cruelty. Stone walls, expertly mortared, soundproof chambers, built to silence screams. Corridors stretching far beyond the house above, like a twisted underground maze. And at the center of it all, directly beneath the kitchen, was the main chamber. There they found them, dozens of children, chained, starving, silent. Each child was shackled to iron rings embedded in stone, ankles bound, movement restricted to a few, desperate steps in each direction. Their ages, between 6 and 16. Their clothes, rags. Their bodies, covered in sores, bruises, and signs of prolonged abuse. Many were clearly sick, coughing, burning with fever, their skin pale and patchy from the damp mold-filled air. But what hit Crawford and Webb the hardest? The silence. After the first cries for help, the children said nothing. Not a whisper, not a word. Just stares, empty, hollow eyes, as if rescue wasn't real, as if they'd already accepted they would die there. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, had to run upstairs. He vomited. Twice. Sheriff Crawford, hardened by decades of law enforcement, just stood frozen, staring, unable to comprehend the scale of what he was seeing. This wasn't chaos. It was organized evil. Every inch of that space had been engineered for long-term captivity. And it got worse. In smaller adjacent rooms, they found evidence of how the Sullivans kept control. One chamber had stocks and restraint devices, crude tools of punishment. Another resembled a primitive medical room, not to heal the children out of kindness, but to keep them just healthy enough to survive. Then they found a third room, and that's where the paper trail began. Shelves lined with handwritten ledgers, each one filled with names, ages, dates of arrival, and cold notes about behavior, health, obedience. This was no accident. No breakdown of morality. This was a system, and these records would reveal something even more terrifying. The Sullivan operation had been running for over 20 years, and children had been arriving there like clockwork, from towns, cities, and farms across multiple states. Bought, taken, disappeared, and no one knew, until now, what happened to the other children. The answer will haunt you. Once Sheriff Crawford and Deputy Webb uncovered the ledgers, the full horror of the Sullivan operation began to take shape. The records went all the way back to 1812, just 1 year after Constance Sullivan arrived in Millbrook. And they weren't random notes. They were painstakingly detailed logs, where each child came from, how they were acquired, what condition they arrived in, and even how they behaved. Some were listed as orphans purchased from overcrowded poorhouses. Some were runaways, lured with promises of warm beds and food. And some simply vanished from their families, kidnapped without a trace. Over the years, more than 90 children passed through that basement, but only 47 were found alive. So what happened to the rest? That answer came in the darkest room of all, at the far end of the underground maze. Hidden behind a crawl space barely wide enough for an adult, the officers made the final, most horrifying discovery: a separate chamber, a mass grave, the remains of at least 36 children, buried in shallow dirt pits beneath the basement floor. The air was thick with lime, a common chemical used to mask the smell of decay. Some had clearly starved or died from illness. Others showed signs of physical abuse, blunt trauma, broken bones, signs of restraint. Crawford and Webb could barely speak. This wasn't just imprisonment. This was a system of death, and it had gone on for over 2 decades, without a single person catching on. The investigation that followed stretched on for months, not just to recover the victims, but to answer the impossible question: how could something this monstrous go unnoticed for so long? And the answer came down to one woman's terrifying intelligence. Constance Sullivan didn't just commit crimes. She designed a perfect illusion. Her disguise? A humble, soft-spoken, church-going woman, caring for poor orphan children. She played directly into the values of her time: Christian charity, community trust, maternal kindness. Whenever someone asked questions, she had letters from fake relatives. She claimed the kids were traumatized and not ready to be seen. She promised they'd be placed in good homes, eventually, and people believed her, because she knew exactly how to make them believe. She even trained the children to call her mother, so that if anyone overheard them, it would sound innocent. When children were seen by outsiders, they'd been coached to stay quiet, to look shy, not scared. And when people raised eyebrows at the huge food orders or the stacks of medicine, she had a reason for everything. "It's just the orphans," she'd say. "They're sick. They need extra care." But here's the kicker. The physical layout of the farm was as brilliant as it was evil. The basement hadn't been dug all at once. No, Ezra Sullivan expanded it slowly, carefully, over years, hiring different workers, giving each only a small part plan, never enough to raise suspicion. Each wall, each room, each lock, built for silence, built for shadows, built for control. This wasn't just one evil family. It was an entire hidden network. By now, Sheriff Crawford and Deputy Webb knew the horror they'd uncovered was far deeper than anything they'd imagined. The underground prison, the 36 shallow graves, the records, the children still alive. But the most chilling part? Every piece of it was designed, down to the last detail. The basement hadn't been built all at once. Ezra Sullivan hired different laborers across 2 decades, each assigned just a small section of the project. No one ever saw the full plan. No one ever questioned it. The soundproofing worked so well that even the closest neighbors never heard more than the occasional thump, and if they did, oh, just farm work, just kids playing. No big deal. But behind the walls, something even more terrifying was at work: psychological warfare. The children, stolen, bought, or lured, were manipulated from the moment they arrived. Constance Sullivan told them, "Your family's abandoned you. No one is coming for you. The outside world is full of monsters. And when you're 6 years old, alone and trapped in darkness, you believe it. Those who obeyed were given slightly better food or more space. Those who rebelled were punished brutally. In front of the others, it wasn't just a cage. It was a system designed to erase hope itself. Over time, most of the children accepted captivity as normal. And outside, the town of Millbrook, shocked, confused, in disbelief. No way. Not Constance. She was in church. She donated. She baked bread for the town fair. Some said she was manipulated by her husband. Others thought it was all a mistake. But as the truth kept coming, there was no denying what Constance Sullivan had done. Because in the basement, the sheriff found something else. Letters. Dozens of them. Written in a strange, coded language. After weeks of careful decoding, what they found was even worse than expected. Constance wasn't working alone. She was part of a network, a multi-state human trafficking operation stretching from Pennsylvania to Georgia. At least 12 other individuals across 5 different states were working the same system. They weren't just stealing children. They were buying, selling, shipping, and trading them like products. The code words were bone-chilling. Merchandise delivered. Quality confirmed. Unruly stock returned to sender. And one letter, dated just 3 months before the raid, came from a contact known only as Morrison. Shipment received. Will advise if any need culling. 2 standouts. Send more like them. Culling. Shipment. Stock. These weren't words used for people. But that's how this network saw them. Not children. Not lives. Just inventory. And it all started with a quiet woman in a pretty farmhouse on a dusty Virginia road. This wasn't just evil. It was a business. A system. A blueprint of horror. One final letter from a man known only as Morrison in Philadelphia made everything horrifyingly clear. It wasn't vague. It didn't hint. It confirmed everything. I have 6 new items of varying ages and conditions suitable for your requirements. That word, items, each one listed with age, health, and temperament, as if they were nothing more than livestock, compliant, uncooperative, requires additional training. This wasn't trafficking in secrecy. It was trafficking in broad daylight, disguised in letters, deals, codes, and cold-blooded calculations. And then came the financial records. Over $8,000 in transactions over 2 decades. That's hundreds of thousands in today's money. Each child, priced by age, condition, and obedience. $50, $100, sometimes even $200. But here's the twist. Constance wasn't just buying children. She was also receiving payments, meaning the Sullivan farm was both a destination and a distribution hub, a supply chain for human lives. And then came another bombshell from a name we've heard before, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who'd visited the Sullivan farm multiple times over the years. Under direct questioning, he made a chilling admission. She always knew exactly what she needed. What doses, what illnesses, what treatments. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't improvising. She was learning, studying, perfecting a system to keep dozens of children alive in captivity. Whitfield revealed that Constance had repeatedly requested medications for malnutrition, respiratory, infections, and, most chillingly, sedatives. The goal? Not healing, not comfort, control. And that's when it all clicked. The layout of the basement, the carefully portioned food, the psychological manipulation, even the punishments. Everything was built around one purpose: to maximize survival, minimize rebellion, and cut costs while keeping children in a prison of silence. And the pieces kept falling into place. Local merchant Thomas Henderson, the man who ran the general store, opened his sales records, and what he found was like reading a logbook of evil. Over the years, Constance had bought more and more supplies, but not like a growing family, like a scaled-up operation. Extra blankets, bulk children's clothes, huge orders of basic medicine. He even remembered odd requests that seemed off at the time. like why a childless couple needed gallons of molasses, boxes of bandages, and enough salt pork to feed an army. And then came the question everyone had been avoiding. What about Ezra Sullivan? Was he just a bystander? A weak husband? No, just when investigators thought they'd uncovered every layer of this nightmare. The final twist hit, like a thunderclap. Everyone had believed Constance Sullivan was the mastermind, but behind every system, every chain, every punishment, was Ezra Sullivan, the enforcer, the monster in the shadows. The children who finally found the strength to speak up, they all said the same thing. Ezra was the one who punished us. He wasn't just building a basement. He was building a system, a refined machine of captivity. He expanded it over the years, modifying rooms, installing reinforced rings, adjusting shackles, optimizing discipline chambers. Ezra's workshop wasn't a tool shed. It was a laboratory of suffering. But then came the final horror. Investigators reanalyzed the ledger entries, the ones that tracked children who disappeared from the farm, and found coded labels like transferred, unsuitable, removed, and suddenly the graves made sense. Those labels didn't mean children had gone home. They meant they'd been sold or buried. And then it got even worse. Authorities across Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina began comparing notes and discovered dozens of missing children cases, eerily matching the profiles from the Sullivan farm. Poor, orphaned, forgotten, vanished. For the first time in U.S. history, federal marshals were called in to coordinate a multi-state manhunt. This wasn't just a local tragedy. This was America's first organized human trafficking ring. And while the legal system scrambled to deal with crimes committed across dozens of jurisdictions, new survivors began to speak. And what they revealed will make your blood run cold. The kids described a brutal system of brainwashing. We were told we were garbage. They said our families sold us. They told us we deserved this. New arrivals were isolated, punished, broken, until they accepted their new reality. Older kids, given small privileges, food, blankets, space, in exchange for controlling the younger ones. Some survivors even resisted rescue at first. They had been so deeply manipulated, they feared the outside world more than the basement. And the big question, how did they get these kids? Finally got its answer. Constance had deals with corrupt orphanages. She had criminal scouts in big cities, looking for runaways, abandoned kids, invisible children. If no one was looking for you, you were easy prey. But the most terrifying part? They were about to grow. Letters revealed they were planning to expand. Other farms, other basements, other safe houses. They were building a franchise of horror. And then came the breakthrough. From someone no one expected. Her name was Rebecca. She was 14, and she had been trapped in the Sullivan basement for 5 long years. But she wasn't broken. She had resisted, remembered, and watched. Rebecca had been kidnapped at age 9, lured by a woman who claimed to be a family relative, who offered her candy and a ride to town. She never made it. She woke up in chains. But Rebecca had something none of the others had. A perfect memory. She remembered everything. Names, faces, conversations, dates. She had overheard deals being made, codes being spoken, shipments being planned. And 2 weeks before the farm was raided, Rebecca saw something huge. A man in a black coat arrived. He came in a fancy carriage. He had 2 men with him. They took measurements and whispered to Constance. She wasn't supposed to hear them, but she did. They were talking about launching another facility, a second basement, a new farm. Rebecca remembered his name, his city, his signature ring. And with that, authorities had their final lead. This wasn't just the fall of one farmhouse. It was the beginning of unraveling a hidden empire. And it all started with a farmhouse that looked so normal on a dusty Virginia road. Just 2 weeks before the raid, a mysterious carriage rolled up to the Sullivan farm. Out stepped a well-dressed stranger flanked by 2 grim bodyguards. Constance lined up Rebecca and 3 other children like products on a shelf, and the man inspected them the way you check a horse at auction, lifting lips to see teeth, squeezing arms for muscle, even making them turn in circles. His verdict? Too damaged for my needs. He left empty-handed, but not before dropping a shopping list, literally. The letter spelled out the exact ages, hair colors, body types, and temperaments he wanted next time. It read like a hardware order. Form, except the items were living children. Signed, H. Blackwood. Return address, Charleston, South Carolina. Investigators raced south and uncovered a bombshell. Henry Blackwood wasn't just any planter. He was loaded and had been buying kids for years. Officially, they were household servants. Unofficially, something even darker than the Sullivan dungeon. Blackwood's orders blew the lid off a new level of horror. Wealthy plantation elites were shopping this trafficking network for labor that could disappear without paperwork, protest, or protection. Some children became test subjects for grisly medical experiments. No anesthesia, no mercy. Others were forced into violent games staged for twisted entertainment. And a handful were used for purposes so grotesque the investigators refused to put the details in. Writing. With every new lead, the probe slammed into walls of money and power. Political pull. Several of the families buying kids held seats in legislatures or owned judges. Outright threats. Anonymous letters warned Sheriff Crawford to drop it or else. Violence. Deputy Webb was jumped walking home. Black eye, crack ribs, 0 witnesses. Intimidation. Dr. Whitfield found his medical office ransacked. Ledgers missing, blood smear on. The door like a calling card. The message was crystal clear. Touch these secrets, and you're next. But Crawford, Webb, and the surviving kids? They'd already stared down one hell. There was no way they'd let a cabal of rich predators bury the truth. And what they uncovered next is the twist that finally toppled the entire empire. Stick around, because in the next episode, we expose the names they never wanted you to hear. Just when investigators thought it couldn't get darker, everything exploded. Fired Dr. Whitfield's medical practice was suddenly boycotted. Top patients vanished. No explanations, just silence. Threats escalated. Witnesses disappeared. And then Timothy was gone. Timothy, one of the bravest survivors, the key witness, the boy who remembered everything, vanished from a secured shelter without a trace. A full search was launched, but they never found him. The message was clear. Testify and you'll vanish too. And then, the most suspicious death of all. Constance Sullivan was found dead in her jail cell. Official cause, suicide. But everyone knew this was a hit. Why? Because Constance was scheduled to testify against the entire child trafficking network. She held the names, the contacts, the paper trail that could blow open the entire corrupt structure. And now, she was silenced. Investigators were rattled. Even Sheriff Crawford began to look over his shoulder. The case had grown into something massive, touching the wealthiest, most powerful families in the country. Just when it looked like the investigation might be buried for good, collision one man came forward. Samuel Pierce, a former overseer on the Blackwood plantation, walked into a federal marshal's office, shaking with guilt and carrying a stack of documents. This wasn't just another witness. This was the inside man. Pierce had worked for Henry Blackwood, the Southern elite who purchased dozens of children from the Sullivan network. What he exposed will haunt your soul. Blackwood's plantation ran 2 systems. 1, the normal one, where enslaved laborers toiled under brutal Southern agriculture. 2, 3, and a hidden facility he called the experimental quarters. 4, what happened in those quarters wasn't farming. It was a human laboratory. Children bought from Sullivan were used for medical experiments, drug testing, disease studies, psychological torture, and grotesque experiments carried out by Charleston Medical College physicians. Pierce described in agonizing detail. They introduced diseases just to see how fast a child's body would break down. They'd inject unknown chemicals to test endurance. They didn't see children, they saw data points. And then Pierce handed over the records. Blackwood had documented everything: reactions, survival rates, psychological breakdowns, death logs, cold, clinical, calculated. At least 37 children from the Sullivan dungeon ended up in those experimental quarters. Only 4 survived. The rest died in agony, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by a world that never knew their names. But now, their stories would finally be heard, and Pierce wasn't done. He had sat in on private meetings, where Blackwood casually discussed child deliveries with other buyers across the South. They treated it like commerce, like shipping crates. This wasn't just a bad farm. This was a nationwide syndicate of powerful men buying, torturing, and killing children for profit and pleasure. And thanks to Pierce, the FBI now had names, addresses, transaction records, and they were about to bring down the unthinkable, just when investigators thought they had uncovered everything. Samuel Pierce dropped a nuclear truth bomb. This isn't just about the Sullivans," he said. "It goes deeper, much deeper. We're talking wealthy plantation owners, Southern elites, business tycoons, and yes, even politicians. This wasn't just crime. It was an underground empire, a shadow market of children being bought, sold, and used like livestock. Fire the most shocking moment? The fall of 1833. A gathering on Henry Blackwood's plantation. A demonstration. And what happened there broke the grand jury. Blackwood invited buyers from across the South, rich men, well-dressed, powerful, to witness what he called a showcase of human property. Samuel Pierce was there, and what he described turned the courtroom into chaos. Imagine this: dozens of trafficked children lined up like cattle, buyers walking past them, inspecting their teeth, muscle tone, obedience, like picking furniture, like they weren't even human. Then came the demonstrations. How quickly a child obeys commands, how they respond to pain, how long they can endure punishment without breaking. One juror ran out, another vomited in the hall. This was real, and it had been hidden for years. And the price tags? Younger equals more expensive. Compliant equals premium. Rare physical traits? They were sold like designer pets. The records showed some children sold for the equivalent of $10,000 plus in today's money, all paid in gold, cash, or land rights. This wasn't desperation. This was cold capitalism built on human pain. But here's the twist. Collision Pierce had receipts, names, numbers, dates, ledgers, everything. And with that intel, the takedown began. Package at dawn across 5 states. Police Garlight federal marshals, Police Garlight local sheriffs, Police Garlight armed task forces launched the biggest multi-state raid in American history. Targets included plantations, warehouses, orphanage fronts, secret holding facilities, even underground bunkers. Every team moved in synchronized silence. No leaks, no warnings, just action. What they found: face screaming in fear, over 100 additional children rescued from hell. Some were found in cages, some locked in root cellars, some kept in barrels, shipping crates, and hidden compartments inside barns. They were terrified, starved, but alive. Investigators also seized detailed ledgers of sales, envelope correspondence between buyers and sellers, money bag stacks of money, test tube medical records, and experiment logs. Everything was meticulously documented. These weren't madmen. They were calculating monsters in business suits. Stop sign and the biggest bombshell? Some of the buyers were names everyone knew: senators, judges, even former governors. This was no longer just about justice. It was about cleansing the soul of a nation. Oncoming FISA results: dozens arrested, hundreds of charges filed, and a permanent federal task force was formed to prevent this from ever happening again. But even as the network fell, the scars remained. Many of the children would carry their trauma forever, but they were finally free. And thanks to the bravery of one man, and the memory of the children lost, The truth couldn't be buried again. Red heart if you made it this far. Type "Justice Prevails" in the comments. What began as whispers beneath a farmhouse floor ended with a nationwide reckoning. The Sullivan case, once buried in the quiet hills of Henry County, exploded into a national scandal that exposed the darkest underbelly of early American society. And when the raids were over, when the files were open, and when the screams had echoed through cellars and plantations were finally heard, justice began its slow march. Balance scale arrests rolled in. Henry Blackwood, the plantation overlord who orchestrated torture under the name of science. 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College, who wore white coats but wielded scalpels, like executioners. A Georgia state legislator, one of the network's preferred customers, who used his political power to shield his crimes. And dozens more judges, businessmen, corrupt wardens, and yes, even law enforcement officers. The records seized during the raids painted a system that was not broken. It had been engineered to serve evil. Test tube the medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and his accomplices were nothing short of war. Crimes. Children were intentionally infected with deadly diseases just to watch what happened. Poison testing. Surgeries without anesthesia. Amputations performed to observe stress response. Eyes gouged, organs removed, neurological experiments, all of it documented, logged, and treated like scientific data. The value of these children's lives measured only in how much pain they could survive. Moneybag the network's reach? Over 30 years in operation. Dozens of buyers and traffickers across at least 7 states. Hundreds of children stolen, bought, and broken. This was an opportunistic crime. This was a machine well-oiled, protected, and fed by the most powerful men in America. Corruption ran deep. Orphanages and poorhouses paid a hand over children. Judges, rubber-stamp fake adoptions, and legal disappearances. Sheriffs looked the other way or silenced whistleblowers. The system wasn't just complicit. It was designed to enable the horrors. But justice? It crawled forward. The trial stretched for years. Some defendants used legal loopholes to walk free. Others simply vanished, protected by powerful connections. Several jurors received anonymous threats. One courtroom mysteriously burned down during testimony. But the truth, it could not be silenced anymore. Fire the legacy. The Sullivan case became a firestorm. It forced lawmakers to confront the unthinkable. And from that horror came real change. The first federal legislation against child trafficking was passed. New legal protections were created for vulnerable children. Oversight of orphanages, adoptions, and poor houses was dramatically reformed. Federal jurisdiction over crimes against children was established. And perhaps most importantly, the public no longer believed the lie that these things couldn't happen. In America, final reflection, it took one suspicious glance, one girl's memory, one man's guilt-ridden courage, to rip the mask off a nightmare that spanned a generation. What was once hidden beneath a farmhouse floor would forever change the laws, the hearts, and the conscience of a nation. Speech balloon, we weren't supposed to find it, Sheriff Crawford once told a reporter. But I'm glad we did. God help us, I'm glad we did. Small blue diamond public reaction. The horrified fascination with the Sullivan case swept through 1830s America like wildfire. Town criers, shouted headlines. Newspapers ran serialized stories for months. Families gathered in silence to hear the tales of the children buried alive under floorboards and saved by one girl's memory. The nation wept, but more importantly, it acted. What was once seen as God's will when children vanished was now recognized as criminal. Coordinated evil. Busts in silhouette survivors' fate. The 47 children rescued from beneath the Sullivan farmhouse had been stripped of their pasts and robbed of any sense of safety. Many had forgotten how to speak. Others had lost the will to. They required years of medical and psychological treatment. Many never fully recovered. Some, tragically, took their own lives in adulthood, unable to overcome the trauma. But one voice pierced through the silence. Rebecca. Her memory became the thread that unraveled the entire network. Though she disappeared from public view after the trial, she lived to the age of 73, raised a family, and finally knew peace, but never spoke of what she'd endured again. Balance scale justice served, partially. Ezra Sullivan, executed in 1836 before a crowd of 3,000. His final words? I followed the devil's path. May the children forgive me. Henry Blackwood, convicted, but died mysteriously in prison in 1841, likely poisoned to keep. Him quiet. 2 Charleston doctors, expelled from the profession, imprisoned for life. Their trial sparked America's first medical ethics reforms. But not all paid. Wealthy clients fled to Europe, where they lived out their days in quiet luxury. Politicians used connections to avoid prosecution. One Georgia legislator, central to the network, was censured but never arrested. The law had finally opened its eyes, but justice was still blind in places where power protected evil. The farm that became a tomb. The Sullivan property was seized, auctioned, and left unsold. The farmhouse was demolished in 1845. The underground prison was filled with concrete and salt, never to be opened again. A small cemetery now marks the land. Most gravestones remain unnamed, each one a whisper of a child lost too soon. Scroll-lasting change. From that nightmare, a better world slowly emerged. Virginia passed the first child protection laws in U.S. history. Background checks became mandatory for anyone taking in children. Oversight of orphanages and adoption agencies began in earnest. And for the first time, the federal government recognized human trafficking as a national issue. Federal marshals gained new power to cross state lines. Interstate trafficking laws were passed. A new branch of child welfare was born. Book's legacy. The Sullivan case was a national trauma, but it was also a turning point. It taught a young nation that evil doesn't always come with horns and fire. Sometimes it comes in the form of a smiling woman in a prairie dress, offering a child shelter. Clapperboard closing thoughts. The past cannot be changed. The names of the lost may never be known, but in their memory, we must make sure it never happens again. Magnifying glass still to the left, unfinished justice. The letters and ledgers preserved from the Sullivan operation became both a blessing and a burden. They identified names and aliases of buyers and sellers, planned expansions of the trafficking network, lists of children in transit who were never found. Many leads faded into silence as memories blurred and evidence vanished with time, but some bore fruit. Over the next 2 decades, Sheriff Crawford, now a federal marshal, pursued those cold trails. He led the rescue of 11 more children in Maryland in 1839. He helped convict a judge in North Carolina who had falsified adoption records for payment. And in 1842, he oversaw the shutdown of a sister operation in Alabama, modeled after the Sullivan Farm. His career became a blueprint for modern child protection law enforcement. Stethoscope, Dr. Whitfield's redemption. Dr. Marcus Whitfield's shame at being unknowingly complicit drove him transform his guilt into lifelong service. He founded some of America's first pediatric free clinics. He authored a series of widely used texts on medical ethics, calling for mandatory reporting, laws when doctors suspect abuse. He testified before Congress in 1848 in favor of federal oversight of orphanages. His transformation from silent witness to tireless reformer is one of the few redemptive arcs of the entire tragedy. Child the Children's Long Shadow. Each child rescued from the Sullivan basement became a living legacy and a painful reminder. Some thrived, many didn't. Rebecca, the girl whose memory had cracked open the conspiracy, lived a quiet, honorable life, but was forever marked by what she had survived. Others, despite help, succumbed to trauma, illness, or despair. A few turned to crime themselves, repeating the cycles of pain they'd learned so young. Their stories, collected in memoirs, court transcripts, and later investigative books, became the moral center of the Sullivan legacy. Books, The Sullivan Case in History. By the 1850s, another Sullivan case had become a common phrase in legal, medical, and educational circles, a grim shorthand for systemic child abuse hiding behind a mask of charity. It became a reference point in law schools when teaching legal reform and jurisdictional challenges, medical schools in courses on ethics and informed consent, police academies in training modules on investigating crimes involving children. The name Sullivan no longer belonged to a woman. It belonged to a warning. Open book closing reflections. Evil does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers lullabies. Sometimes it offers warm bread and a quiet bed. And sometimes it calls itself mother. The Sullivan case proved something America was just beginning to realize in the 1830s. That monsters can wear human faces. That laws must evolve to protect the weak. And that truth requires both courage and memory to survive. This is the most insane story we've ever covered. A hidden basement, 47 chained children, and a crime so massive it rocked the entire country. And guess what? It all started with one guy who refused to stay silent. Get ready, because this story is about to take you on a roller coaster of horror, suspense, and the courage it takes to face evil head-on. Let's go. 20 years. That's how long this monstrous nightmare hid in plain sight. On the outside, the Sullivan farm looked like your typical 1830s countryside property. Inside, a dungeon, a literal underground prison. It was all run by a woman named Constance Sullivan, who the town thought was just a sweet lady taking care of orphans. Spoiler alert, she was anything but sweet. For 2 decades, nobody suspected a thing, until one man, William Hutchinson, heard something he couldn't ignore, strange noises in a locked cellar door. He reported it, and that changed everything. Sheriff Crawford and his deputy went to investigate. They expected a harmless visit. What they found, something straight out of a horror movie. They heard crying, coming from beneath the kitchen floor. When they pried open the locked basement door, they were hit with smells so awful the deputy vomited. Inside, they found children, malnourished, sick, chained to stone walls, some as young as 6. The silence was the most chilling part. The kids didn't scream. They didn't even speak. They'd lost all hope. But it got worse. Behind one narrow tunnel, they found a burial site. 36 shallow graves. Some died from sickness. Others from punishment. Every wall in that basement whispered of torture. And Constance Sullivan had designed it all carefully, methodically, cruelly. She ran a full-blown trafficking ring with buyers, suppliers, and coded letters that made it sound like a trading company. Only the products were children. And guess what? She wasn't working alone. Letters recovered from the basement pointed to a man named Henry Blackwood in South Carolina, a rich plantation owner who had even more horrifying plans for these children. Experiments, torture, buyers with preferences like they were shopping on Amazon. This was bigger than anyone had imagined. It was a national network. And the Sullivans? They were just one branch. As more evidence came out, the town of Millbrook had to face a terrible truth. This evil had been right next to them for 20 years. Neighbors, churchgoers, school teachers, all had seen something and dismissed it. The lesson? Evil doesn't always come with a pitchfork. Sometimes it comes with a warm smile and fresh baked bread. So what happened next? An explosion of legal reforms. Federal marshals raided properties across multiple states. Over 100 more. Children were rescued. And for the first time in U.S. history, laws were passed to protect vulnerable kids at a national level. Sheriff Crawford became a federal marshal. Dr. Whitfield, the local doctor who had unknowingly treated the children, spent the rest of his life advocating for orphans. And Rebecca, the brave 14-year-old who remembered everything, she became the voice that blew the entire ring wide open. She never spoke publicly again, but her testimony changed the world. The Sullivan basement was sealed with concrete. A memorial was built for the unknown children who never made it out. But their story still haunts America. Because here's the truth. This didn't happen in a war zone. It happened in a peaceful town. Because people looked the other way. Because people assumed everything was fine. Until it wasn't. This is why stories like these matter. to remind us that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they live right next door. If this gave you chills, share IT with a friend. Smash that like button so more people see it. And subscribe so you don't miss the next unbelievable story from America's forgotten past. And tell us in the comments, do you think the Sullivan case revealed everything? Or are there more secrets buried in the Virginia hills? Let's uncover them together. See you in the next one.